When you picture Doc Holliday, what comes to mind? Is it the sharp-suited, pale Southern gentleman with a deadly stare, his vest perfectly buttoned, that iconic mustache never out of place? The legend goes deeper than just marksmanship and a gambling table. Doc is supposed to have remained impeccably dressed, almost dapper, even as he coughed blood and ducked the law. But how much of that image survives contact with reality? What did it actually mean to be well-dressed as a fugitive, dying of tuberculosis on the American frontier, when just getting a bath could require a bribe or a bucket, and laundry was as rare as a quiet night in Tombstone? We're about to find out if Doc Holliday really looked, smelled, or felt clean as he staggered from hotel to hotel, hiding from the law, outlasting his enemies, while his body was actively falling apart. The idea that Doc Holliday was always well-dressed isn't just a Hollywood cliché. It's a claim you'll find repeated in period press and echoed by later storytellers, newspapers, and chroniclers, even as early as the 1880s. Described Doc as always dressed well or fastidious in his appearance. But it's important to note that these claims are often broad and sometimes repeated, secondhand. Reporters and later biographers leaned on that image, sometimes to sharpen the contrast between Doc's genteel upbringing and his violent profession, and sometimes just because the legend was already sticky. So, when we hear that Doc Holliday cut a sharp figure despite everything, attribute that to the press of the time and generations of mythmakers. It's not a diary entry, not a hotel keeper's note, and not a doctor's description after a close-up inspection. Here's the catch. If you go looking for direct, daily physical descriptions of Doc's hygiene or clothing, you'll quickly run into silence. The period sources, newspapers, reminiscences, even letters almost never mention specifics. There are no surviving bath logs, no itemized laundry lists, and no first-hand hotel, housekeeper, or guest accounts that detail whether Doc soaked his shirts in the sink, bribed a maid for a clean towel, or spent nights in the same blood-stained collar. What we do have are general impressions, and sometimes the absence of complaint. But the gritty bodily details, the ones that would tell us whether the well-dressed myth stood up to sweat, blood, and outlaw living, are almost entirely missing from the record. So let's open the real question. What direct accounts do we have for Doc Holliday's hygiene, clothing, or laundry at all? If the period press was more invested in his reputation than his reality, what traces, if any, can we actually find of how he kept himself clean, dressed, and presentable, while his lungs and his luck ran out? That evidence gap is where the legend starts to look shaky, and where the grim, day-to-day struggle might finally come into view. And here's the first uncomfortable truth. After combing through hundreds of pages of biographies, memoirs, and scrapbooks about Doc Holliday, there's almost nothing direct about his day-to-day hygiene. No hotel clerk wrote down which rooms he left musty. No bartender jotted a note about blood on his cuffs. And no one seems to have published a first-person account of seeing Doc soak his socks or haul his laundry out to dry. The record gives us a gaping silence about how he managed to bathe, dress, or even wipe the blood off his face after a coughing fit. What does survive are scattered references, rumors about illness, occasional remarks about stained clothes, or the vague sense that Doc was somehow both pitied and avoided. If you go looking for the gritty details, the state of his shirt collars, whether he bathed more often than the average cowboy, even how he smelled on a bad day, you find only fragments. The specifics simply aren't there. So where did the image of Doc Holliday as the sharp, well-dressed, silk-tied gambler actually come from? Most of those details show up not in contemporary news reports or eyewitness diaries, but in much later retellings in the Hollywood myth machine. Biographers, decades after Doc's death, and especially filmmakers, built up the elegant but deadly persona, often describing him in spotless linen and pressed cuffs. But these are not period fact. They're second-hand legend, stitched together from the conventions of Western storytelling. Attribute those crisp cravats and perfect suits to the world of late biographers and screenwriters, not to the dusty reality of 1880s Arizona. Look back at the sources closest to Doc's lifetime, and while they rarely give us hygiene details, they do slip in some telling hints. There are accounts attributed to people who saw him in saloons or boarding houses of visible stains on his clothing, of blood on his hands after a coughing fit, of people stepping back or wrinkling noses when he entered a room. Some period observers described outright disgust or quietly shunned him because of the constant reminders that he was sick and possibly contagious. Even Wyatt Earp, who stuck by Doc, acknowledged that the physical toll of tuberculosis was obvious. These details, while scarce, undercut the notion of an always dapper outlaw. Instead, they reveal a figure who routinely struggled not just with illness, but with the embarrassment and social consequences of being visibly unwell. Over time, though, the way Doc Holliday looked in public started to change, at least in the stories told about him. As the decades passed, press accounts and memoirs began to polish his image. The stains faded, the coughing fits were downplayed, and the dirty, sickly outcast quietly became the dangerously elegant legend we see in movies. Attribute that transformation to retrospective myth-making, not to any sudden access to cleaner shirts. The distance between Doc's reality and his reputation only grew as the physical details were scrubbed away, leaving behind a picture-perfect outlaw that would never have survived a real sniff test in Tombstone's hotel lobby. There's no shortage of stories about Doc Holliday's physical decline, and some of the most telling details come directly from people who saw him up close. According to period observers and memoirists who actually encountered Doc near the end, it wasn't just his haunted eyes or his hacking cough that gave him away. He was often spotted with bloodstains on his shirt, cuffs, or lapels, sometimes fresh, sometimes smeared after an attempt to hide them, and his sleeves could be flecked with the evidence of a recent coughing fit. One eyewitness described watching Doc dab at his mouth with a handkerchief, only to leave a visible stain at the corner of his lips. The effect was unmistakable. Whatever legend would later claim about his style, the original impression he made was that of a man losing a battle with his own body, his illness leaking out in plain sight. Even if Doc had been healthy, the fight to stay clean would have been nearly impossible for any traveling gambler in the Old West. Strongly supported by period context and medical knowledge, we know that regular bathing was a luxury, often an ordeal reserved for the wealthy or for rare special occasions. Hotel bathrooms, if available at all, were shared, usually with icy water lugged by hand. Laundry was not included in the room rate, and having your only shirt washed might mean going half a day with nothing to wear. For someone constantly on the move, dodging the law and running low on cash, paying for laundry was a decision weighed against having enough money for food or medicine. And then there were lice. By all accounts, lice were a routine nuisance in hotels and rooming houses. Bedding was only occasionally changed, and clothes, especially woolen coats, offered ideal hiding places. For the sick or unwashed, lice were almost guaranteed, making hygiene not just difficult but an ongoing, crawling misery. If you were a guest in a typical Western hotel, the process for getting your laundry done was its own humiliating adventure. Clean shirts and underclothes had to be sent out, often carried by a hotel maid or taken to a nearby Chinese laundry, where the cost could eat up a gambler's winnings in a single week. Public bathhouses, where they existed, charged by the visit, and privacy was limited. For visibly ill or poor guests, there was an extra layer of stigma. Staff might hesitate to handle laundry that was blood-stained or heavily soiled, and other guests could be openly hostile if someone with a hacking cough stood in line for the tub. This wasn't just about personal embarrassment. It could mean being quietly denied service or being watched for signs of contagious disease. Tuberculosis didn't just make Doc's hygiene harder, it made it nearly impossible to keep up appearances. Medical reality, supported by accounts of TB in the period, tells us he would have dealt with night sweats, frequent chills, and the constant risk of open sores or bleeding gums. Sweaty sheets, blood-stained pillowcases, and damp, sticky underclothes would pile up, and changing them wasn't a simple matter of asking at the front desk. Each symptom amplified the filth and the risk of social rejection. Even with money, Doc couldn't wash away the reminders of his illness. Without it, he became the embodiment of every hotel manager's worst nightmare. A guest whose body, no matter how neatly dressed in legend, threatened to spoil the air for everyone else. For a sick outlaw like Doc Holliday, the fight for cleanliness wasn't just unwinnable, it was barely waged. Tuberculosis meant endless sweats, bleeding gums, and a cough that could drench a handkerchief faster than housekeeping could replace it. In the rough world of frontier hotels and boarding houses, laundry was expensive, bathing was rare, and the threat of lice was constant. Even healthy travelers struggled to stay clean, but for Doc, every symptom stacked the odds against him. Fresh linens or a real bath were less likely with each new stain or coughing fit, and any attempt at lice control was a losing battle at best. Most days, his reality was a grim surrender to filth, clothes that never quite dried, towels that never quite came, and a body that defied every effort to keep presentable. This is the truth when you combine what's known about 19th century hygiene, medical realities of TB, and the unglamorous grind of travel while dying. For Doc Holliday, staying even slightly clean was nearly impossible. Attribute humiliation and avoidance to documented observers. Period accounts and contemporary observers noted not just Doc's illness, but the visible, humiliating fallout. People who met him in his later years described turning away from his presence, and some hotel staff and townsfolk reportedly avoided direct contact, whispering about his stains, his smell, and the sickly pallor that signaled both danger and disgrace. This wasn't a private struggle. It was a public spectacle. The legendary gambler, once rumored to be the best-dressed man in the room, found himself shunned. The myth of the deadly, dashing Doc collapsed for those who saw the real man, stained shirt cuffs, sunken cheeks, and a body in shambles. His hygiene problems, broadcast by every cough and every spot of blood, made him not just a threat but an object of disgust, a man marked by disease and rejected by the very society that once thrilled to his legend. The historical record supports a stark conclusion. Doc Holliday's daily life was not the story of a sharp-dressed, untouchable outlaw. but of a man locked in a humiliating, losing battle with his own body. Every stain, every foul-smelling shirt, and every sidelong glance from hotel staff was a reminder that style and reputation couldn't shield him from the relentless decay of disease. The version of Doc that survives in legend is wishful thinking, a fantasy that can't survive the evidence of what TB, poverty, and hotel reality did to a man on the run. When you peel back the legend, what's left is not the image of a dashing anti-hero, but something far more human and grim. Doc Holliday's true reality was survival, not in gunfights or card games, but in the daily humiliations of blood, filth, and being quietly pushed to the margins. The myth wants us to see elegance and danger. The evidence shows a sick man scraping by, enduring public rejection, and losing the fight to keep dignity as his body betrayed him. That's the real cost of outlaw fame, and it's far messier than the movies ever let on.